Every dig site tells two stories. The first is the one written in artifacts and architecture, the story of how people lived. The second is quieter, harder to find, and much harder to forget. It's the story of how they suffered. Archaeologists spend their careers chasing the first story, but sometimes the ground only gives up the second. Today we're looking at 20 discoveries that turned routine excavations into some of the most heartbreaking finds in human history. Beneath the ruins of a Roman-era bathhouse in the coastal city of Ashkelon, Israel, archaeologists clearing out an old drainage channel began noticing small bones mixed into the sediment. As excavation continued, the number kept climbing until it reached nearly 100 infants. Researchers initially assumed the remains reflected the ancient practice of favoring male children over female ones, a grim but well-documented pattern in parts of the classical world. Testing complicated that theory. Many of the infants were male. One leading explanation ties the site to an ancient brothel thought to have operated above the baths, suggesting the infants may have been the unwanted consequence of that trade. No firm answer has ever been confirmed, and the mystery remains one of archaeology's most disturbing unsolved puzzles. In China, researchers examining a centuries-old female mummy noticed something wrong with her posture. Her limbs were bent at unnatural angles, and her hands showed damage inconsistent with a peaceful burial. The evidence pointed to an agonizing possibility. She had been buried while still alive. Investigators believe she suffered a difficult childbirth, likely from retained placental tissue, and was mistakenly pronounced dead. Funeral customs of the time called for rapid burial, and her family, unaware of her condition, sealed her into a coffin too small to allow movement. The scratches on her coffin's interior lining suggest she regained consciousness underground and fought desperately before succumbing. At a burial site in Imola, Italy, researchers uncovered the remains of a pregnant woman who died near the end of her pregnancy, sometime in the 7th or 8th century. Beside her legs lay a second, much smaller set of bones, those of her child, delivered after her death through a rare phenomenon known as post-mortem fetal extrusion. Gases from decomposition can, in unusual cases, push a fetus out of the body after burial. Adding another layer to the mystery, the woman's skull bore a small surgical opening, evidence of an ancient procedure meant to relieve pressure or treat illness. Whatever killed her, her body kept changing long after she was laid to rest. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it didn't just destroy Pompeii, it froze it. Excavators working a villa just outside the city in 2020 found two men who had survived the volcano's first blast only to be killed by a second, more violent one the following day. Their bodies, cast in the volcanic material that once surrounded them, preserved the shape of their final moments, hands clenched, limbs drawn in from thermal shock. One was likely a wealthy landowner, the other enslaved. Whatever separated them in life, death treated them the same. It's one of many such casts pulled from Pompeii, each one a snapshot of a city that had no warning its final day had arrived. High in the Andes, at nearly 20,000 feet, archaeologists opened a burial chamber containing 3 children whose bodies had been preserved almost perfectly by the cold. They were victims of Capacocha, an Inca ritual in which children, believed to be the purest possible offering, were sacrificed to the gods during times of crisis. Traces of coca leaves and alcohol found in their remains suggest they were sedated beforehand, likely to keep them calm through their final climb. The eldest, a teenage girl now known as the Maiden, was found seated as though asleep. 2 younger children were buried nearby. Their clothing, hair, and even facial features remain remarkably intact, a haunting reminder of how much was taken from them so young. In the highlands of Peru, researchers excavating a burial site uncovered a mummy roughly 1,200 years old, positioned in a way that immediately raised questions. The body's hands were pressed against its own face, and rope had been wound tightly around the torso and limbs. Some archaeologists suspect this may indicate a punitive burial, reserved for someone considered dangerous even in death. Others believe it could reflect a ritual meant to prevent the deceased spirit from wandering. Without written records from the culture in question, The true purpose of the binding remains a matter of educated guesswork. Northern Europe's peat bogs have an unusual chemistry, low oxygen, high acidity, that can preserve human remains for thousands of years, skin and organs intact. The most famous of these bog bodies is Tollen Man, discovered in Denmark in 1950, whose calm expression made him look as though he'd died only recently. Closer study revealed a rope still around his neck. He had been hanged, likely as part of a ritual sacrifice. Other bog bodies, including Old Croghan Man found in Ireland, show even more brutal treatment: beatings, mutilation, and binding before death. These weren't accidental deaths. They were, in most cases, deliberate ends carried out for reasons tied to belief systems modern researchers can only partly reconstruct. Fear of the supernatural has shaped burial practices for centuries, and few examples illustrate that as vividly as the so-called vampire burials found across parts of Europe. In one 17th-century grave in Poland, archaeologists found a woman buried with a sickle positioned across her neck and a padlock fastened to her ankle, both intended, by the beliefs of the time, to keep her from rising from the grave. Similar burials elsewhere include bodies found with heavy stones wedged into their mouths, meant to prevent biting. These weren't isolated superstitions. They tended to spike during outbreaks of disease, when frightened communities searched for something, or someone, to blame. Near what was once thought to be a simple stretch of ancient wall in northern China, archaeologists uncovered something far larger: a fortified Bronze Age city called Shirmao, built around a massive stepped pyramid. Beneath the structure, researchers found several pits containing the skulls of roughly 80 young women, arranged with clear intention rather than discarded. Human sacrifice was not unheard of in early Chinese history, sometimes tied to religious offerings, sometimes to funerary customs involving servants of the deceased. What makes Shirmao especially unsettling is the sheer scale of the pits and the fact that, thousands of years later, researchers still can't say with certainty what ritual demanded so many lives. In 1629, the Dutch trading ship Batavia wrecked off the coast of Western Australia. Most of its passengers survived the initial disaster and made it to a small island in the Houtman-Abrolhos archipelago. What followed was worse than the shipwreck itself. A mutiny led by a merchant named Geronimus Cornelis spiraled into a months-long massacre, claiming the lives of roughly 125 men, women, and children. Survivors were murdered and buried in shallow graves across the island, which locals now call Beacon Island, though it's better known by its grim nickname, Murder Island. Excavations beginning in the 1960s uncovered mass graves and remnants of makeshift forts built by those trying to defend themselves, turning a shipwreck into one of Australia's darkest chapters. Beneath modern Mexico City lies the remains of the Huitzilopochtli, a massive skull tower built by the Aztec civilization near the heart of their capital, Tenochtitlan. Discovered in 2015, the structure contains hundreds of human skulls arranged in circular tiers and mortared together with lime. Archaeologists initially assumed the skulls belonged to captured warriors, but further analysis revealed the remains of women and children as well, showing that the practice of sacrifice reached far beyond the battlefield. The tower stood near a temple dedicated to the god of war and the sun, and was believed necessary to keep the world in balance. It remains one of the most visually striking and unsettling monuments to ritual death ever uncovered. In 1845, two British ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, set out under Sir John Franklin to chart the Northwest Passage through the Arctic. Neither ship returned, and for decades the fate of the 129-man crew was a mystery. Search expeditions over the following centuries slowly assembled a grim picture: scattered bones, abandoned supplies, and written records describing failing health and desperation. Bone analysis later revealed cut marks consistent with cannibalism during the crew's final, starving weeks, while lead contamination, possibly from poorly sealed food tins, may have worsened their physical and mental state. The wrecks of both ships were eventually found remarkably intact on the Arctic seafloor, silent witnesses to one of exploration's most tragic failures. In 2016, a team led by archaeologist Stella Chrysolaki uncovered a mass grave near Athens containing the remains of roughly 80 individuals, all dating to around 632 BCE. What stood out immediately was the shackles. Every set of hands and feet had been bound before death. The prevailing theory connects the burial to a failed political uprising, with the group possibly executed as punishment for rebellion. Yet oddly, despite the violence of their deaths, the bodies had been arranged with a degree of care not typically given to condemned criminals, suggesting the victims may have held higher status than their execution implies. In China's Qinghai province, archaeologists excavating the site of Lagia, sometimes called China's Pompeii, uncovered the remains of a mother and child locked in an embrace roughly 4,000 years old. A catastrophic earthquake around 2000 BCE triggered a landslide that buried the settlement in an instant. The mother's arms were wrapped tightly around her child, a final, futile attempt at protection. Excavators found multiple similar pairings throughout the site, evidence of an entire community caught without warning. The Lagia find offers one of archaeology's clearest windows into a single, terrible moment, and into the instinct to shield the people we love, even when there's nothing left to be done. At the ancient site of Tepe-Hazanlu in Iran, University of Pennsylvania archaeologists discovered two skeletons intertwined in what looked, unmistakably, like an embrace, nearly 2,800 years old. Early assumptions framed them as a man and woman, but later DNA testing revealed both individuals were male. They appear to have taken shelter in a grain storage bin during a violent attack on the city, likely by the neighboring Urartu kingdom around 800 BCE. Unlike many of the bodies found elsewhere at the site, often buried with jewelry or weapons, these two were found with nothing, their final act stripped down to nothing but each other. Deep in Spain's Atapuerca Mountains lies Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones, a cave system where researchers have recovered the remains of at least 28 early humans, some dating back over 400,000 years. It's one of the richest collections of early hominin remains anywhere in the world. One skull in particular changed how scientists understood this population. It showed two nearly identical fractures, almost certainly caused by repeated blows from the same object. It represents one of the earliest suspected cases of interpersonal violence in the human fossil record, evidence that conflict between people is far older than written history itself. In 1933, archaeologist Robert du Mesnil du Buisson was excavating the Roman-era city of Dur-Europos in Syria when he found a tunnel packed with the bodies of Roman soldiers, seemingly killed in an instant. At the tunnel's far end lay a single Persian soldier. Traces of sulfur and bitumen residue along the walls led researchers to a startling theory. The tunnel had been used as an ancient chemical weapon. Persian forces besieging the city are believed to have ignited sulfur compounds to generate toxic gas, deliberately suffocating Roman troops trying to tunnel beneath the walls. If the theory holds, it's among the earliest documented uses of chemical warfare in human history. In 1993, researchers opened a 2,400-year-old burial chamber on Siberia's Yukok Plateau and found the remarkably preserved body of a young woman belonging to the Pazara culture. She had been buried with striking care, a coffin carved from a single large trunk, tattoos of stylized deer across her skin, food offerings, and several horses meant to accompany her into the next life. The details suggested she held real status within her community, possibly as a healer or spiritual figure. Later medical analysis revealed she had likely been suffering from breast cancer, and that a fall may have hastened her death. Her burial tells us she was valued. Her bones tell us she was probably in pain long before the end. In 2009, construction work in Dorset, England uncovered a mass grave unlike anything previously found in Britain, the remains of 54 young men, all decapitated, all apparently Scandinavian. Rather than the chaos of a battlefield, the burial appeared deliberate, skulls piled separately from the bodies. Isotope analysis suggested the men were Viking raiders or mercenaries, likely captured and executed by local Anglo-Saxon forces. Some researchers have connected the find to the St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002, when King Athelred ordered the killing of Danes living in England, though the exact circumstances remain unresolved. Whoever they were, their deaths were fast, coordinated, and clearly meant to send a message. In 16th century Scotland, fear of witchcraft reached such intensity that entire communities turned on their neighbors. In Aberdeen alone, 1597 saw more than 30 separate witch trials. Historians later discovered that suspects weren't held in ordinary jail cells. Many were chained inside St. Mary's Chapel, a building that had once served as a place of worship, using iron rings still visible in its walls today. The idea that accusations could turn a sanctuary into a prison says as much about the power of fear as it does about the individuals who suffered because of it. It stands as a quiet, physical reminder of how easily community trust can collapse into paranoia and how real people paid the price for it. Archaeology rarely sets out to find sorrow. It goes looking for pottery shards, foundations, and forgotten cities, and more often than we'd like, it finds people instead, caught mid-moment, mid-struggle, mid-love. Each of these discoveries is a reminder that history isn't just made of empires and inventions. It's made of individual lives, most of them unrecorded, all of them real. The ground remembers what the history books forgot.